I'm sitting on the deck of my 45-foot yacht, watching the Miami sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and I can't stop smiling. The champagne in my crystal flute catches the last rays of sunlight, and the gentle rocking of the boat beneath me feels like a lullaby of vindication. In my other hand, I hold a printed email that arrived this morning, a notification from my credit monitoring service about suspicious activity on accounts that don't belong to me, but somehow bear my name as an authorized user. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The irony isn't lost on me. 3 months ago, my daughter-in-law Cassandra told me I would ruin their anniversary cruise with my presence. She said I was too old, too dramatic, and too embarrassing to be seen with them in public. She actually used the word mortifying when describing the thought of introducing me to their friends at the resort. Now, as I sip Dom Pérignon on my own private yacht while they're probably discovering that their credit cards have been mysteriously maxed out and their bank accounts frozen, I realize that Cassandra was right about one thing. I absolutely did ruin their cruise. I just did it from a much more comfortable location than she anticipated. My name is Myrtle Torres, and until 6 months ago, I thought I was living the golden years every widow dreams of. At 68, I had a beautiful home in Coral Gables that my late husband Roberto and I had bought when it was just a modest 3-bedroom ranch, back in 1982. Over 4 decades, we'd transformed it into something that belonged on the cover of Architectural Digest, with hand-painted Portuguese tiles in the kitchen, a garden that bloomed year-round with orchids and bird of paradise, and a pool that reflected the swaying palm trees like a postcard from paradise. Roberto had been gone for 3 years now, taken by a heart attack that came so suddenly we didn't even get to say goodbye. But he'd left me well provided for. The insurance business he'd built from nothing had grown into one of the most successful agencies in South Florida, and when he sold it 2 years before his death, the payout had been substantial enough to ensure I'd never want for anything. I wasn't just financially comfortable, I was wealthy. Wealthy enough to travel wherever I wanted, buy whatever caught my fancy, and most importantly, wealthy enough to be generous with the people I loved. And I loved my son Marcus more than life itself. Marcus was our miracle baby, born after 12 years of trying and 3 heartbreaking miscarriages. Roberto used to joke that Marcus was worth the wait because he got all the best parts of both of us. He had Roberto's business sense, and my stubborn determination, Roberto's easy laugh, and my fierce loyalty to family. When he graduated from the University of Miami with his MBA and announced he wanted to start his own real estate development company, Roberto and I didn't hesitate to back him financially. That investment had paid off beautifully. At 35, Marcus owned a thriving business that specialized in luxury waterfront properties throughout South Florida. He lived in a stunning penthouse in Brickell, drove a Tesla that cost more than most people's houses, and had married Cassandra Phillips, a woman who looked like she'd stepped off the pages of a fashion magazine. I should have seen the warning signs from the beginning, but love makes you blind to red flags, especially when you want so desperately for your child to be happy. The first time Marcus brought Cassandra home for dinner, she'd spent the entire evening photographing our house for her Instagram account, posing in front of my antique Cuban furniture and rare orchid collection like she was shooting a lifestyle magazine spread. Roberto had been alive then, and I still remember the look he gave me across our dining room table as Cassandra held up her phone to get the perfect angle of our hand-carved mahogany dining set. His raised eyebrows spoke volumes, but I'd shushed him with a warning glance. Marcus was glowing with happiness, and that was all that mattered to me. After dinner, while Marcus and Roberto discussed business on the patio, Cassandra had cornered me in the kitchen as I loaded the dishwasher. The expensive china and crystal glasses clinked softly as I arranged them, and I was humming under my breath, pleased that the evening had gone so well. "Mrs. Torres," Cassandra had said, her voice honey-sweet but with an undertone I couldn't quite identify. "Your home is absolutely gorgeous. You have such exquisite taste." I'd beamed at the compliment, wiping my hands on my favorite kitchen towel, the one embroidered with tiny flamingos that Roberto had brought me from Key West years earlier. "Thank you, dear. Roberto and I have collected these pieces over many years. Each one has a story." "I can tell," she'd replied, running her perfectly manicured fingers along the edge of my grandmother's hand-painted serving platter. "Marcus is so lucky to come from such a refined family." I hope someday we'll be able to create something just as beautiful together. At the time, I thought she was talking about building a home with Marcus, creating their own collection of meaningful objects and memories. I'd actually teared up a little, thinking about how wonderful it would be to have a daughter-in-law who appreciated the finer things in life, who understood that a home should be more than just a place to sleep. I had no idea she was already mentally cataloging everything for future reference. The wedding had been a production that would have made a Hollywood director weep with envy. Cassandra's parents owned a chain of upscale boutique hotels throughout the Caribbean, and they'd insisted on hosting the ceremony at their flagship property in Barbados. The guest list read like a who's who of Miami society, with socialites, business moguls, and minor celebrities filling the pristine white chairs arranged on the beach. I'd worn a custom-designed dress in soft lavender silk, had my hair done by the same stylist who worked with the Real Housewives of Miami, and felt like a queen as I walked my son down the aisle in the absence of his father. Roberto would have been so proud to see Marcus in his black tuxedo, grinning like he'd won the lottery as Cassandra appeared in a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. The reception had lasted until dawn, with a 12-piece orchestra, 3 separate dinner courses, and enough champagne to float a small yacht. When Cassandra tossed her bouquet, it had landed directly in my hands, and she'd laughed and said, "Looks like you're next, Myrtle." The crowd had erupted in good-natured cheers, and I'd blushed and joked about being too old for romance. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have thrown that bouquet straight into the ocean. The first year of their marriage had been blissful, at least from my perspective. Marcus and Cassandra had moved into a beautiful waterfront condo in Coconut Grove, and I'd loved having them so close. Sunday dinners became a weekly tradition, with Cassandra often asking me to teach her my recipes for Roberto's favorite Cuban dishes. She'd stand beside me in my kitchen, taking notes on her phone as I showed her how to properly season black beans or get the perfect crispy texture on plantains. "Marcus talks about your cooking all the time," she'd say, watching intently as I demonstrated the technique for making perfect café con leche. "He says it reminds him of his childhood, of feeling safe and loved." I'd been so touched by her apparent desire to carry on our family traditions. When she'd asked if she could borrow my grandmother's recipe box to photograph the cards for her own collection, I'd handed it over without hesitation. Those recipes had been passed down through 3 generations of Torres women, handwritten in Spanish on index cards yellowed with age and splattered with evidence of countless family meals. I'd even offered to have copies made for her, but she'd insisted that photographing them herself would be more meaningful. She'd spent an entire afternoon in my kitchen, carefully documenting each recipe with her professional camera, asking questions about ingredient substitutions and cooking techniques that had been passed down through oral tradition rather than written instruction. "Your family history is so rich," she'd said, handling the cards with what seemed like reverence. "I want to make sure I get every detail right, so I can honor these traditions in our home." I'd actually cried that day, overwhelmed with gratitude that my son had found a woman who valued our heritage and wanted to become a true member of our family. I'd called my sister Elena in Tampa that evening, gushing about how lucky I was to have such a thoughtful daughter-in-law. The second year had brought subtle changes that I'd initially attributed to the natural adjustment period of marriage. Cassandra had seemed more distant during our Sunday dinners, often checking her phone or mentioning other plans they needed to get to. When I'd suggested we take a girls' trip to Havana to explore our family's roots, she'd politely declined, saying she was too busy with her new interior design business. Yes, she'd started an interior design business. Specifically, she'd started advertising herself as a specialist in authentic Latin luxury and vintage Cuban elegance. Her Instagram account had exploded with photos of spaces that looked suspiciously similar to my home, featuring the same color palettes, similar furniture arrangements, and even some of the specific decorative elements I'd collected over decades. When I'd mentioned the similarity to Marcus, he'd laughed it off. "Mom, you should be flattered." Cassandra learned from the best. "Besides, isn't imitation the sincerest form of flattery?" I'd tried to see it that way, I really had. But something had felt wrong about seeing my personal style commodified and marketed to wealthy clients who wanted to buy authenticity rather than earn it through years of careful collecting and genuine appreciation for the culture. The third year had brought the grandchild announcement that should have been the happiest moment of my life. Marcus had called me at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, his voice vibrating with excitement. "Mom, sit down," he'd said. "Cassandra's pregnant. You're going to be a grandmother." I'd screamed so loudly that my neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, had called to make sure I wasn't being murdered. I'd immediately started planning, mentally converting Roberto's old office into a nursery for when they visited, researching the best baby stores in Miami, and calling Elena to share the incredible news. But when I'd arrived at their condo that evening with a bottle of sparkling apple cider and a onesie that said, "Abuela's little angel" in Spanish, Cassandra's reaction had been lukewarm at best. "That's sweet, Myrtle," she'd said, holding the tiny garment at arm's length like it might contaminate her. "But we're actually planning to stick with English only for the baby. We want him or her to fit in with our social circle." The words had hit me like a physical blow. Fit in with their social circle? As if speaking Spanish, the language of my grandparents, the language Roberto had whispered to me in our most intimate moments, the language that connected us to centuries of family history, would somehow be a liability for my grandchild. Marcus had tried to smooth things over. "Mom, you know how important networking is in business. Cassandra just wants to make sure the baby has every advantage." But I'd seen something in Cassandra's eyes that night that chilled me to the bone. Not embarrassment or concern for the baby's future, but something colder, something that looked suspiciously like calculation. The pregnancy had proceeded normally, with regular doctor visits and baby showers thrown by Cassandra's sorority sisters from her University of Miami days. I'd been invited to exactly one of these events, a small gathering at an upscale restaurant in South Beach, where I'd been introduced to her friends as Marcus's mother, rather than by name. I'd sat through 2 hours of conversation about designer baby clothes, exclusive preschools, and vacation homes in the Hamptons, contributing little, because I had nothing in common with these women, who treated motherhood like a luxury accessory, rather than a sacred responsibility. When I'd tried to share stories about Marcus's childhood or offer advice based on my own experience raising a son, I'd been met with polite smiles and swift changes of subject. The baby shower gifts had been a study in excess: $1,000 strollers, diamond-encrusted pacifiers, cashmere baby blankets that cost more than most people's monthly rent. When my turn had come to present my gift, a hand-carved wooden rocking horse that Roberto had made during my pregnancy with Marcus, the silence had been deafening. "How unique," one of Cassandra's friends had said, her tone suggesting she found it anything but pleasant. "Is it vintage?" "It's handmade," I'd replied, running my fingers along the smooth wood that Roberto had sanded and painted with such love. "My late husband carved it himself." Cassandra had thanked me with the same enthusiasm she might have shown for a pair of socks, then quickly moved on to the next gift. I'd watched her friends exchange glances and small smirks, and realized with sinking clarity that I was being humored rather than welcomed. Little Isabella had arrived on a humid August morning, 7 pounds and 4 ounces of absolute perfection. When Marcus had called from the hospital to tell me I had a granddaughter, I'd dropped everything and rushed to Baptist Hospital with flowers, balloons, and enough Cuban coffee to keep the entire maternity ward awake for a week. But when I'd arrived at Cassandra's private room, I'd been informed by a stone-faced nurse that visiting hours were restricted to immediate family only, and I'd need to wait until the next day. When I'd explained that I was the baby's grandmother, she'd checked her clipboard and told me that Mrs.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Torres Phillips had specifically requested that visits be limited to parents only for the first 48 hours. Torres Phillips. Not just Phillips, which would have been traditional, but a hyphenated name that put her family first. I'd stood in that hospital hallway, still holding my flowers and balloons, feeling like I'd been slapped across the face. Marcus had called later that evening to apologize, claiming it had been a miscommunication, that Cassandra was exhausted and hadn't been thinking clearly. But I'd heard voices in the background, laughter and conversation that suggested she was feeling well enough to entertain other visitors. When I'd finally been allowed to meet my granddaughter the next afternoon, she'd been the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Dark hair like Marcus had been born with, tiny fingers that gripped mine with surprising strength, and Roberto's distinctive nose that had been passed down through 3 generations of Torres men. "She's going to be a heartbreaker," I'd whispered, cradling her against my chest while Cassandra watched from her hospital bed with an expression I couldn't quite read. "We're calling her Isabella," Cassandra had announced. Isabella Phillips Torres. Another hyphenation. Another subtle reminder of the hierarchy being established in my granddaughter's identity. But I'd been too enchanted by the baby to care about name politics at that moment. Isabella was here, she was healthy, and she was mine to love. I'd thrown myself into grandmother mode, with the enthusiasm of a woman who'd waited 68 years for this role. I'd babysat whenever Cassandra and Marcus wanted date nights, arriving with homemade baby food and lullabies sung in Spanish to spite Cassandra's preferences. I'd converted Roberto's office into a proper nursery with a crib, changing table, and walls painted soft yellow with clouds that I'd hand-painted myself. Isabella had taken her first steps in my living room, reaching for the colorful Cuban tiles that lined my fireplace. She'd said abuela before she'd said mama, a fact that had delighted me and clearly irritated Cassandra. When Isabella had started showing interest in music, I'd taught her simple songs in Spanish, watching her little face light up as she tried to pronounce the unfamiliar words. For 6 months, I'd thought we'd found our rhythm as a family. Then came a conversation that changed everything. It had been a Tuesday evening in March, and I'd been watching Isabella while Marcus and Cassandra attended a business dinner with potential investors. Isabella had been particularly fussy that day, teething and cranky, but she'd finally fallen asleep in my arms while I rocked her in the chair that had once soothed her father. When they'd returned to pick her up, I'd been reluctant to wake her. She looked so peaceful, her little fist curled against her cheek, her breathing soft and even. Cassandra had taken one look at the sleeping baby and made a comment that should have warned me what was coming. "She's gotten too comfortable here," she'd said, not quite under her breath. "It's going to make the transition harder." I'd looked up from the rocking chair, careful not to disturb Isabella. "What transition?" Marcus and Cassandra had exchanged one of those loaded glances that married couples use to communicate entire conversations in a single look. Then Marcus had sat down on my sofa, his expression serious in a way that reminded me of Roberto when he'd had to deliver bad news to insurance clients. "Mom, we need to talk about some changes we're making," he'd begun, his voice gentle but firm. "Cassandra and I have been discussing our situation, and we think it would be better for everyone if we establish some new boundaries." The word boundaries had sent a chill down my spine. In my experience, people only talked about boundaries when they were planning to cut you out of something important. "What kind of boundaries?" I'd asked, unconsciously tightening my hold on Isabella. Cassandra had taken over the conversation then, her voice taking on the professional tone she used with her interior design clients. "Myrtle, we appreciate everything you've done for us, but we think Isabella needs more consistency in her routine. The constant back and forth between houses is confusing for her development." I'd stared at them both, waiting for the punchline or the clarification that would make this make sense. Isabella had been nothing but happy and well-adjusted. Her pediatrician had commented on how secure and confident she seemed for such a young child. "She seems perfectly fine to me," I'd said carefully. "Dr. Martinez said she's hitting all her milestones early." "That's not the point," Cassandra had replied, and there had been an edge to her voice that hadn't been there before. "The point is that we're her parents, and we need to make decisions based on what we think is best for our family. Our family. Not my family or the family. Our family, with the clear implication that I was not included in that definition." Marcus had jumped in, probably sensing the tension building in the room. "Mom, we're not saying you can't see Isabella. We just think maybe once a week is more appropriate than every few days. And we'd prefer if visits happened at our place so she doesn't get confused about where home is." Once a week. At their place, with them supervising every interaction I had with my own granddaughter. I'd looked down at Isabella's sleeping face and felt something crack inside my chest. "I see," I'd said quietly. And what brought about this sudden concern for Isabella's confusion? Another glance between them. Another silent conversation I wasn't part of. "It's not sudden," Cassandra had said. "We've been thinking about this for a while. Dr. Peterson, our family therapist, suggested that too many caregivers can create attachment issues in young children. Family therapist. They'd been seeing a family therapist and discussing my role in Isabella's life with a professional stranger without ever mentioning it to me. They'd been analyzing and critiquing my relationship with my granddaughter behind my back, painting me as some kind of problem that needed to be managed. What kind of attachment issues? I'd asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Cassandra had launched into what sounded like a rehearsed explanation about child psychology and developmental best practices. But I'd stopped listening after she'd mentioned that Isabella was becoming too dependent on me for comfort and entertainment. Too dependent on her grandmother. As if loving your grandchild and wanting to be an active part of her life was somehow harmful. As if the bond between Isabella and me was a problem to be solved, rather than a gift to be treasured. I'd handed Isabella over to Marcus without another word, gathered my purse and keys, and left their condo feeling like I'd been diagnosed with a terminal illness. The drive home had been a blur of tears and rage and disbelief that my own son would participate in cutting me out of his daughter's life. That night, I'd called Elena and sobbed into the phone for 2 hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. She'd listened with the patience of a woman who'd raised 4 children of her own and had strong opinions about family loyalty. Mija, she'd said finally, that girl is poison. She's been planning this from the beginning. I'd wanted to defend Cassandra, to believe that this was just new parent anxiety or misguided professional advice. But deep down, I'd known Elena was right. This hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision based on Isabella's needs. This had been a calculated move to distance me from my granddaughter, and Marcus had either been manipulated into agreeing or had been complicit from the start. The new visitation schedule had been implemented immediately. Instead of spending lazy afternoons with Isabella, teaching her Spanish songs and letting her help me tend my orchids, I'd been relegated to supervised visits in Cassandra and Marcus's sterile living room, where every toy had its designated place and every activity had to be approved in advance. Isabella had cried the first few times I'd left without taking her home with me, her little arms reaching for me as I walked toward the door. Those tears had broken my heart, but they'd also confirmed what I'd suspected. The new arrangement wasn't better for Isabella. It was only better for Cassandra's need to control every aspect of her daughter's life. The final insult had come 2 months later, when Marcus had called to tell me about their anniversary cruise. They'd booked a 2-week luxury voyage through the Caribbean, staying in the same suite where they'd honeymooned 5 years earlier. Isabella would be staying with Cassandra's parents in their Key Biscayne mansion, where she'd have round-the-clock care from a professional nanny. It sounds wonderful, I'd said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. I'm sure you both need the break. Actually, Mom, Marcus had said, his tone carefully casual. Cassandra was wondering if you'd like to join us. Her parents are bringing some friends, and there are still a few cabins available. For one shining moment, I'd felt a surge of hope. Maybe this was Cassandra's way of making amends, of including me in their lives again. Maybe she'd realized how important family was and wanted to start over. That sounds lovely, I'd said. What are the dates? But when Marcus had started explaining the details, something in his voice had sounded off. Too cheerful, too insistent, like he was trying to sell me something I hadn't asked to buy. It's the harmony of the seas, he'd continued. Royal Caribbean's biggest ship. There are restaurants, shows, rock climbing walls, surf simulators. Cassandra thought you might enjoy all the activities. Activities designed for people decades younger than me. Entertainment that assumed I had the energy and interest of someone Isabella's age rather than someone approaching 70. The more Marcus talked, the more I'd realized this wasn't an invitation. It was an attempt to manage me, to keep me busy and distracted while they enjoyed their romantic getaway. Let me think about it, I'd said, though I'd already known my answer. That evening, I'd called the cruise line myself to get more information about the specific sailing Marcus had mentioned. The customer service representative had been helpful and enthusiastic, painting a picture of non-stop entertainment and around-the-clock activities that had sounded exhausting rather than appealing. But it had been my conversation with my neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, that had really opened my eyes. She'd taken a similar cruise the year before with her daughter's family and had described it as a floating daycare center for adults who refused to grow up. Mija, she'd said, sipping the café con leche I'd made for our weekly chat, those ships are designed for people who need constant stimulation. Pool parties at midnight, karaoke contests, dance lessons, fitness classes. I felt like I was at summer camp, not on vacation. The more I'd thought about it, the more I'd realized what Cassandra's real motivation had been. She hadn't wanted me to join their romantic anniversary cruise. She'd wanted me contained and managed, stuck on a ship with nowhere to go and plenty of distractions to keep me from dwelling on how excluded I felt from their lives. It had been a brilliant plan, actually. Get the problematic mother-in-law out of the way while they celebrated their marriage, but do it in a way that looked generous and inclusive. If I'd complained about feeling lonely or left out, they could have pointed to the expensive cruise they'd invited me on as evidence of their thoughtfulness. I'd called Marcus back the next morning and politely declined the invitation, citing concerns about seasickness and a preference for land-based vacations. He'd seemed relieved rather than disappointed, which had confirmed my suspicions about whose idea the invitation had really been. Maybe next time, he'd said, but his tone had suggested there wouldn't be a next time. That had been 3 months ago. 3 months of once-weekly visits with Isabella. 3 months of watching my granddaughter grow and change from a distance. 3 months of being treated like a tolerated relative rather than a beloved grandmother. But today, as I sit on my yacht watching the sun set over Biscayne Bay, I realized that Cassandra's attempt to sideline me had actually done me a tremendous favor. It had forced me to remember who I was before I became a grandmother, before I became a widow, before I became someone who could be manipulated and managed by a woman half my age. I am Myrtle Torres, daughter of immigrants who built something from nothing. I am the wife of a man who taught me that respect is earned, not demanded. I am the mother of a son I raised to value family above all else, even if he's forgotten that lesson temporarily. And most importantly, I am a woman with resources, connections, and a lifetime of experience dealing with people who mistake kindness for weakness. Tomorrow, Marcus and Cassandra will discover that their anniversary cruise has been canceled due to irregularities with their payment method. Their credit cards will be mysteriously maxed out, with charges from luxury retailers, 5-star restaurants, and high-end travel services. Their bank accounts will be frozen pending investigation of suspicious activity, all perfectly legal, of course. When you're an authorized user on someone's accounts, and when you have power of attorney documents that were signed during happier times for emergency purposes, you have access to quite a lot of financial information. But that's a story for tomorrow. Tonight, I'm going to finish my champagne, call Isabella on the phone I gave her for emergencies, which Cassandra doesn't know about, and plan the next phase of my granddaughter's education and family loyalty. Because if there's one thing I've learned in 68 years, it's that you don't mess with a Cuban grandmother's family. Ever. The changes in my relationship with Marcus and Cassandra didn't happen overnight. But looking back now, I can see the pattern as clearly as the wake behind a speedboat. Each incident seemed innocent enough on its own, but together they formed a deliberate course toward my complete exclusion from Isabella's life. It started with the birthday party planning. Isabella's second birthday was approaching in September, and I'd naturally assumed I'd be involved in organizing the celebration. After all, I'd thrown Marcus elaborate birthday parties throughout his childhood, complete with piñatas, filled with Cuban candy, homemade tres leche cake, and games that kept 20 kids entertained for hours. I'd already started brainstorming themes when Cassandra called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice bright, with the kind of forced cheerfulness that immediately put me on guard. "Myrtle, I wanted to give you a heads up about Isabella's birthday party," she'd said, and I could hear the clicking of her laptop keyboard in the background. "We've decided to do something really special this year." I'd set down my coffee cup and reached for the notebook where I'd been jotting down party ideas. "That's wonderful, dear. What did you have in mind?" "Well, we're renting out the children's area at the Miami Seaquarium for a private party. They have this amazing dolphin show presentation, and the kids can feed the stingrays in the touch tank. It's going to be absolutely magical." The Miami Seaquarium. A public venue with professional entertainment. The kind of party that required deposits, contracts, and coordination with event staff. The kind of party that left no room for personal touches or family traditions. "That sounds very elaborate," I'd said carefully. "How many children are you inviting?" "Oh, it's not really a children's party," Cassandra had laughed. "I mean, there will be some kids there, but we're mainly inviting our friends from the business community. You know how important networking is for Marcus's company?" This seemed like a perfect opportunity to combine celebrating Isabella with maintaining our professional relationships. I'd sat in my kitchen, staring at my notebook full of games and craft activities, feeling like I'd been speaking a foreign language this entire conversation. A 2-year-old's birthday party that wasn't really for children, designed around adult networking rather than celebrating my granddaughter's special day. What about family? I'd asked. Will Elena and the cousins be invited? Another pause, filled with more keyboard clicking. We're keeping the guest list pretty focused this year. Maybe next year we can do something bigger with extended family. Next year. Always next year, as if including the people who actually loved Isabella was some kind of burden to be postponed indefinitely. I see, I'd said. Well, I'd love to help with the planning. I have quite a bit of experience with children's parties. That's so sweet of you to offer, Cassandra had replied, and her tone had been the same one you'd used to thank a stranger for holding a door open. But we've already hired an event coordinator. Everything's under control. Under control. As if my involvement would somehow threaten the smooth execution of this professional networking event disguised as a birthday celebration. What about the cake? I'd pressed. I was planning to make Isabella's favorite tres leches cake. She always lights up when she sees me bringing out the mixing bowls. Actually, the Seaquarium's pastry chef is creating a custom cake designed to match the dolphin theme. It's going to be this incredible multi-tier creation with sugar sculptures and edible pearls. Very Instagram-worthy. Instagram-worthy. Not delicious or meaningful or made with love, but photogenic enough to enhance Cassandra's social media presence. I'd thought about all the birthday cakes I'd made for Marcus over the years, how he'd insisted on licking the bowl and helping me pipe the frosting roses, how Roberto had always declared each one the most beautiful cake he'd ever seen. What can I bring then? I'd asked, determined to contribute something personal to my granddaughter's celebration. Honestly, Myrtle, just bringing yourself is enough. Oh, and maybe dress on the nicer side? I know you usually prefer comfort over fashion, but there will be some important people there, and we want to make sure everything looks cohesive. The insult had been delivered so smoothly I'd almost missed it. My usual preference for comfort over fashion, as if I were some kind of slovenly embarrassment who couldn't be trusted to dress appropriately for my own granddaughter's birthday party. I'd hung up the phone feeling like I'd been uninvited to my own life. That evening, I'd called Elena to vent my frustrations, and her response had been swift and brutal. She's treating you like hired help, Elena had said bluntly. Worse than hired help, actually. At least they pay the help and value their contributions. The birthday party itself had been everything Cassandra had promised, and nothing Isabella had needed. The venue was stunning, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay and professional photographers capturing every moment for what seemed to be a promotional video rather than a family celebration. Isabella had been overwhelmed by the crowds, the noise, and the structured activities, spending most of the party clinging to the nanny Cassandra had hired for the occasion. When the elaborate dolphin-themed cake had been wheeled out, Isabella had taken one look at the towering sugar sculpture and burst into tears. She's just tired, Marcus had explained to the concerned event coordinator, but I'd seen the real problem immediately. This party wasn't designed for a 2-year-old. It was designed for adults who wanted to use a child's birthday as an excuse for an elegant social gathering. I'd spent most of the afternoon standing awkwardly near the gift table, making polite conversation with Cassandra's business associates, who clearly had no idea who I was or why I was there. When people asked about my relationship to the birthday girl, I'd been introduced as Marcus's mother, rather than Isabella's grandmother, as if my role in the family was somehow secondary to my role as an extension of my son. The gift opening ceremony had been the final insult. Isabella had been guided through the process by Cassandra, who'd narrated each present for the photographers, while Isabella had seemed more interested in the wrapping paper than the expensive toys inside each box. When Isabella had reached my gift, a simple wooden toy piano that Roberto had made for Marcus when he was the same age, Cassandra had held it up briefly for the cameras before setting it aside without comment. No story about its origin, no mention of the craftsmanship that had gone into creating it, no acknowledgement that it represented 3 generations of family history. How lovely, one of Cassandra's friends had commented with obvious insincerity. Handmade gifts are so authentic, as if authenticity were somehow quaint and outdated compared to the mass-produced luxury items that filled the rest of the gift table. That night, I'd driven home from the seaquarium feeling like a stranger in my own family. The elaborate party had been flawlessly executed, and completely soulless, a perfect metaphor for what my relationship with Marcus and Cassandra had become. The Halloween incident had been even more revealing. I'd volunteered to take Isabella trick-or-treating in my neighborhood, where the houses were close together and the families had been giving out candy to local children for decades. Coral Gables on Halloween was magical, with Spanish Revival mansions decorated with tasteful autumn displays and neighbors who remembered you from year to year. Isabella had been excited about the plan, chattering about her princess costume and asking if we could visit Mrs. Delgado's house, because she always gave out full-size candy bars. I'd been looking forward to the evening for weeks, imagining my granddaughter's delight as she discovered the joy of trick-or-treating in a safe, familiar neighborhood. But 2 days before Halloween, Cassandra had called with a change of plans. "Myrtle, I'm so sorry, but we're going to have to cancel Halloween with you this year," she'd said, not sounding sorry at all. Marcus's business partner is having a Halloween party at his house in Star Island, and it's really important for us to be there. Star Island, where the houses were so far apart you'd need a golf cart to get from one front door to the next, where security gates kept out anyone who didn't belong to the right tax bracket, where Halloween was probably more about adult costume contests than children collecting candy. "What about Isabella?" I'd asked. "She's been looking forward to trick-or-treating all month." "Oh, she'll love the party," Cassandra had assured me. "There will be other children there, and they're hiring entertainment. Face painters, balloon artists, maybe even a magician. Professional entertainment instead of the simple joy of knocking on neighbors' doors and saying trick-or-treat. Hired performers instead of the organic interactions with community members who'd watched Isabella grow up. A controlled environment instead of the adventure of exploring a neighborhood on foot. Couldn't she do both? I'd suggested. Maybe trick-or-treat with me in the afternoon and then go to the party in the evening? "That would be too much stimulation for one day," Cassandra had replied, using the child psychology language she'd become fond of since starting therapy. Dr. Peterson says consistency is key for toddler development. Dr. Peterson again, the family therapist I'd never met but who seemed to have strong opinions about my role in Isabella's life. I'd wondered how many of their sessions focused on the problem of my involvement, how many professional recommendations were specifically designed to limit my access to my granddaughter. "I understand," I'd said, though I'd understood nothing except that I was being systematically excluded from yet another family tradition. "Maybe next year." "Definitely next year," Cassandra had agreed, but her tone had suggested she was already planning next year's excuse. The Thanksgiving disaster had been the breaking point. I'd been hosting Thanksgiving dinner for over 40 years, first with Roberto, and later as a widow who looked forward to filling her house with family once a year. My dining room table could seat 12 comfortably, my kitchen was equipped to handle a feast for 20, and I had recipes that had been passed down through generations of Torres women. Elena and her family always drove down from Tampa for the occasion, turning my house into a bustling hub of conversation, laughter, and the kind of chaos that only comes from 3 generations trying to share one kitchen. Isabella had attended her first Thanksgiving dinner at my house the year before, sitting in Roberto's old high chair and smearing sweet potato all over her face, while the adults had shared stories and argued about politics in the loving way that Cuban families do. I'd been planning this year's menu for weeks, sourcing the perfect turkey from a local farm, preparing my grandmother's secret stuffing recipe, and making sure I had enough high chairs for Isabella and Elena's youngest grandchild. The house would be decorated with autumn flowers from my garden, the table would be set with my best china, and the dining room would smell like garlic, cumin, and the bay leaves I always tucked into my black beans. But when I'd called Marcus in early November to confirm the details, his response had caught me completely off guard. "Mom, we're actually doing Thanksgiving at Cassandra's parents' house this year," he'd said, his voice carrying that carefully casual tone I'd come to recognize as a warning sign. "They've invited us to join them at their house in Key Biscayne, the Phillips family Thanksgiving. At their waterfront mansion with catered food and formal place settings, where conversation would be polite and restrained, where Isabella would be expected to sit still and eat unfamiliar food, where there would be no children running around, or multiple conversations happening in Spanish and English. "What about our family tradition?" I'd asked, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "Elena is already planning to drive down with the kids." "Maybe you could do something with Elena's family," Marcus had suggested. "And we could stop by for dessert or coffee." Stop by for dessert. At the Thanksgiving dinner I'd been hosting since before he was born, in the house where he'd grown up, at the table where Roberto had carved his first turkey as a young husband, learning to be the head of a household. "Marcus," I'd said carefully, "this is our family tradition. Isabella should be learning about her heritage, spending time with her Cuban relatives, eating the foods that connect her to her ancestors. Mom, traditions can change. Cassandra's family has their own way of doing things, and it's important for Isabella to experience both sides of her heritage." Both sides of her heritage. As if Isabella's Cuban identity was just one option among many, rather than half of who she was. As if the traditions that had sustained our family through immigration, poverty, and loss were somehow equal to the Phillips family's catered social gatherings. "What about Elena and the cousins?" I'd pressed. "They're expecting to see you and Isabella." "They'll understand," Marcus had said, but his tone had suggested he hadn't actually asked them to understand anything. "Maybe next year we can alternate between families." Next year again. Always next year, when the current year's exclusion would somehow make sense. When the pattern of choosing Cassandra's family over mine would feel natural rather than deliberate. I'd spent that Thanksgiving hosting Elena's family and missing Marcus and Isabella with an ache that felt physical. We'd set places for them anyway, just in case they'd changed their minds, and their empty chairs had served as a constant reminder of how my family was being slowly dismantled. Elena had been furious on my behalf, launching into a bilingual tirade about respect and family loyalty that had lasted through the entire meal. Her grandchildren had asked repeatedly where cousin Isabella was, why she wasn't learning to make empanadas with them, why Uncle Marcus hadn't come to carve the turkey like he had the year before. "She's dividing your family on purpose," Elena had said as we'd cleaned dishes later that evening. "First the boundaries with babysitting, then the birthday party planning, now the holidays. She's making sure Isabella only knows one side of her heritage." I wanted to defend Marcus, to believe he was just trying to balance competing demands, rather than actively choosing his wife's preferences over his mother's feelings. But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Every decision seemed designed to distance Isabella from my side of the family. Every change in routine somehow benefited Cassandra's vision of who her daughter should become. The Christmas gift incident had been the final confirmation of what I'd suspected for months. I'd spent weeks creating a photo album for Isabella, filled with pictures of her with Roberto during his final year, images of her learning to walk in my garden, snapshots of her helping me cook in my kitchen. Each page had been carefully arranged with acid-free materials and labeled in both English and Spanish, creating a visual record of her early childhood that emphasized her connection to both languages and cultures. The album had also included pictures of Roberto's parents, immigrants who'd arrived in Miami with nothing but determination and had built a life that allowed their grandson to attend college and start his own business. I'd wanted Isabella to know where she came from, to understand that her success was built on the sacrifices and dreams of people she'd never meet, but whose blood ran through her veins. When I'd presented the album to Isabella on Christmas morning, her face had lit up with recognition and delight. She'd pointed to pictures of herself and said, "Isabella," with the pride of a toddler who is just learning to see herself as a separate person. She'd traced the images of Roberto with her finger and said, "Abuelo," in her sweet, uncertain pronunciation. But I'd noticed Cassandra watching the gift exchange with an expression that could only be described as calculating. She'd thanked me politely for the album, then set it aside with the same dismissive gesture I'd seen at Isabella's birthday party. 2 weeks later, when I'd asked Isabella if she'd been looking at her photo album, she'd stared at me blankly. When I'd mentioned specific pictures that had made her laugh on Christmas morning, she'd shown no recognition. The album had disappeared, filed away somewhere in Cassandra's organized home where it wouldn't confuse Isabella with too many images of her Cuban heritage. That night, I'd called Elena and told her everything. Not just the photo album incident, but all of it. The birthday party where I'd been treated like an unwelcome guest. The Halloween plans that had been changed without consideration for my feelings. The Thanksgiving tradition that had been abandoned in favor of Cassandra's family. The gradual erosion of my relationship with my granddaughter. "She's erasing you," Elena had said bluntly. "She's systematically removing your influence from Isabella's life, and Marcus is letting her do it." The cruise invitation had come just days after the photo album had disappeared. Marcus had called on a Thursday evening, his voice filled with the kind of forced enthusiasm that meant he was delivering a message someone else had written. "Mom, Cassandra and I have been talking, and we want to invite you on our anniversary cruise next month," he'd said. "It's going to be an amazing trip through the Caribbean, and we thought you might enjoy seeing some of the islands." The Caribbean, where my grandparents had been born, where Roberto and I had honeymooned, where every sunset reminded me of the Spanish words Roberto used to whisper when he thought I was sleeping. It should have been a thoughtful invitation, a chance to reconnect with my heritage and spend quality time with my family. But something in Marcus's tone had made me suspicious. He'd sounded like he was reading from a script, hitting certain talking points without genuine enthusiasm for my company. "That's a lovely thought," I'd said carefully. "Tell me more about the itinerary." He'd launched into a detailed description of the ship's amenities, the ports of call, the various activities available on board, rock climbing walls, surf simulators, Broadway-style shows, poolside dance parties, everything designed for people decades younger than me, activities that assumed I wanted to be entertained rather than spend meaningful time with my family. "It sounds very energetic," I'd said. "What about Isabella? Will she be joining us?" "Oh no, she's too young for a cruise like this," Marcus had explained. "Cassandra's parents are going to watch her while we're gone. They're planning all sorts of fun activities." The Phillips grandparents again, getting quality time with Isabella while I was shipped off to sea with strangers who wanted to go rock climbing and attend pool parties. It was brilliant, actually. Get the problematic grandmother out of the way while ensuring Isabella bonded more closely with the approved side of her family. When would this be? I'd asked, though I'd already decided I wouldn't be going. "Valentine's week," Marcus had said. "Perfect timing for a romantic getaway, and the weather should be beautiful." Valentine's week. Their anniversary cruise was during the most romantic week of the year, and they were inviting his mother to join them. Either they had no concept of appropriate boundaries, or this invitation was designed to keep me occupied while they enjoyed their romantic vacation and Isabella grew more attached to her other grandparents. "Let me think about it," I'd said, knowing I'd already made my decision. That weekend, I'd driven to the Miami cruise terminal and taken a tour of a ship similar to the one Marcus had described. The tour guide had been enthusiastic and professional, showing our group the various entertainment venues, dining options, and activity centers that kept passengers busy from dawn until midnight. It had been everything Marcus had promised. Impressive, overwhelming, and completely exhausting. I'd watched families with teenagers racing between activities, couples in their 30s dancing at poolside parties, and senior citizens struggling to keep up with the relentless schedule of organized fun. "The great thing about cruise vacations," the tour guide had explained, "is that there's never a dull moment. You'll never be bored or lonely because there's always something happening. Never a dull moment. Never time for quiet conversation or meaningful connection. Never opportunity for the kind of slow, gentle bonding that happened when grandparents and grandchildren had unstructured time together. It was the perfect vacation for people who wanted to avoid actually spending time with each other." That evening, I'd called Marcus and politely declined the invitation, citing concerns about seasickness and a preference for land-based travel. His relief had been audible through the phone, confirming my suspicion that the invitation had been motivated by obligation rather than genuine desire for my company. "Maybe next year," he'd said automatically. "Maybe." I'd agreed, though we both knew there wouldn't be a next year for this particular kind of invitation. The conversation that had changed everything had happened the week before they'd left for their cruise. I'd stopped by their condo unannounced, something I rarely did anymore since the boundaries conversation, but I'd been in the area after a doctor's appointment and had decided to take a chance on seeing Isabella. Cassandra had answered the door in workout clothes, her hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail, her expression shifting from surprise to annoyance when she'd seen me standing in the hallway. "Myrtle, she'd said, not moving aside to let me in. We weren't expecting you. I was nearby and thought I'd say hello to Isabella, I'd explained. Is she awake? She's actually napping right now, Cassandra had replied, though I could hear the sound of cartoons playing in the living room behind her. Maybe you could call next time to make sure it's a good time? Call to visit my own granddaughter. Make an appointment to see the child I'd helped raise for 2 years. I'd felt my patience finally snap like a rubber band stretched too far. Cassandra, I'd said, my voice calm but firm. I think we need to have an honest conversation about what's happening here. Her expression had shifted slightly, surprised by my directness. For months, I'd been polite and accommodating, accepting every new restriction and boundary without complaint. This was apparently the first time I'd pushed back. I'm not sure what you mean, she'd said, but her tone had been guarded. I mean the systematic way you've been limiting my access to Isabella, I'd said clearly. The birthday party I wasn't allowed to help plan, the Halloween that got canceled, the Thanksgiving tradition that got abandoned, the photo album that disappeared. Cassandra had glanced around the hallway, probably hoping none of her neighbors were witnessing this conversation. When she'd realized I wasn't going to lower my voice or move this discussion to a more private location, her demeanor had shifted entirely. Myrtle, she'd said, her voice taking on the patient tone you'd use with a difficult child. I think you're being a little dramatic. We've never excluded you from anything. Haven't you? I'd asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been working very hard to make sure Isabella doesn't get too attached to my side of the family. That's ridiculous, she'd said. But I'd seen something flicker in her eyes. Not guilt exactly, but recognition that her strategy had been noticed. Is it? I'd pressed. Tell me, Cassandra, what exactly is it about me that you find so threatening? What is it about Isabella knowing her Cuban heritage that bothers you so much? That had been the moment when Cassandra's carefully maintained facade had finally slipped. Her expression had hardened, and when she'd spoken again, her voice had been cold and precise. You want to know what bothers me? She'd said. It bothers me that you think your way of doing things is the only way. It bothers me that you act like Isabella's relationship with you is more important than her relationship with my family. And it bothers me that you can't accept that Marcus and I are her parents, and we get to decide what's best for her. I've never suggested that my relationship with Isabella was more important than yours, I'd said quietly. I've only asked to be included in her life. No, what you've asked is to control her life, Cassandra had shot back. You want her speaking Spanish at home, even though we've decided English is better for her future. You want her eating Cuban food, even though we're trying to establish healthy eating habits. You want her following traditions that don't fit with the life we're building for her. The life they were building for her, as if Isabella's heritage was something to be overcome rather than celebrated. As if connecting her to her cultural roots was somehow harmful to her development. And what about the cruise invitation? I'd asked. Was that part of your plan to include me, or was it just a way to keep me busy while Isabella bonded with your parents? Cassandra had been quiet for a long moment, and when she'd finally spoken, her voice had been brutally honest. You want to know the truth? She'd said. Marcus thought you seemed lonely since Roberto died, and he was worried about you spending too much time dwelling on the past. We thought a cruise would be good for you, help you meet new people and try new experiences instead of sitting in that house surrounded by memories. Sitting in that house surrounded by memories. As if my grief was an inconvenience. As if my connection to Roberto's memory was somehow unhealthy. As if the home we'd built together was a prison rather than a sanctuary. And Isabella? I'd asked. What role do you see me playing in her future? Cassandra had looked me directly in the eyes then, and her next words had been delivered with the kind of brutal clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. I see you being a grandmother who respects boundaries, she'd said. Someone who supports our decisions instead of undermining them. Someone who adds value to Isabella's life without trying to recreate the past or impose your own agenda on her upbringing. Someone who adds value. As if my love for Isabella was a business proposition that needed to demonstrate return on investment. As if my role in her life was contingent on my willingness to disappear whenever my presence became inconvenient. I see, I'd said quietly. And if I'm not willing to accept that limited role? Cassandra had smiled then, but it hadn't been a pleasant expression. "Then I guess you'll find yourself seeing a lot less of Isabella," she'd said. "Because at the end of the day, Myrtle, we don't actually need your permission or cooperation to raise our daughter the way we think is best." The threat had been delivered so smoothly, wrapped in such reasonable language, that it had taken me a moment to process its full implications. Comply with our vision of your role, or lose access to your granddaughter entirely. Accept our boundaries and restrictions, or be cut out of Isabella's life completely. I'd stood in that hallway for another moment, looking at this woman who'd systematically dismantled my relationship with my family while maintaining a facade of consideration and inclusion. She'd been planning this conversation for months, waiting for me to finally push back so she could articulate the terms of my surrender. "Well," I'd said finally, "at least now I know where we stand." "I hope so," Cassandra had replied. "Because Marcus and I are leaving for our cruise tomorrow, and when we get back, we're hoping to start fresh with everyone understanding their role in Isabella's life." Start fresh. Code 4. Accept the new reality where you're a peripheral figure in your granddaughter's life, or find yourself excluded entirely. I'd walked back to my car that day feeling like I'd been given a terminal diagnosis. Not the kind that doctors deliver with gentle voices and treatment options, but the kind that comes from realizing that people you loved were capable of cruelty you'd never imagined. That evening, I'd sat in my garden with a glass of wine and Roberto's old business files, thinking about power and leverage and the difference between being kind and being weak. I'd spent 2 years accepting every insult and restriction because I'd believed that maintaining peace was more important than defending my dignity. But as I'd looked through Roberto's meticulously organized financial records, I'd remembered something important. I wasn't just Isabella's grandmother. I wasn't just Marcus's grieving mother. I was a woman with resources, connections, and a lifetime of experience in getting things done. Cassandra had made a critical error in her calculations. She'd assumed that because I'd been accommodating, I was powerless. She'd mistaken my desire to avoid conflict for an inability to create it. Tomorrow, Marcus and Cassandra would board their luxury cruise ship, confident that they'd successfully managed the problem of my involvement in Isabella's life. They'd spend 2 weeks enjoying romantic dinners and couples massages, secure in the knowledge that Isabella was bonding with the approved grandparents, while the problematic one had been neutralized. They had no idea that their financial world was about to implode in ways that would make their relationship problems seem trivial by comparison. Because while they'd been planning their cruise, I'd been making some plans of my own. And unlike their vacation itinerary, my plans didn't require their permission or cooperation to be executed. The revelation came to me at 3 a.m, sitting in Roberto's old study surrounded by financial documents that painted a picture I'd never bothered to examine closely. For the past 3 years, I'd been content to let my accountant manage the details while I lived comfortably off the interest and dividends from Roberto's carefully built empire. But grief has a way of making you passive, and I'd allowed myself to become financially invisible in my own life. Now, spread across Roberto's mahogany desk were bank statements, investment portfolios, and legal documents that told a very different story about my position in the world. I wasn't just comfortable. I wasn't just well off. I was wealthy enough to buy and sell people like Cassandra without breaking a sweat. The insurance agency sale had brought in $12 million. The real estate investments Roberto had made throughout the 80s and 90s were now worth triple their original value thanks to Miami's explosive growth. The stock portfolio he'd built with the methodical patience of a man who understood long-term thinking had grown into something that would have shocked even him. But it was the discovery of a manila folder labeled Family Security that had made my hands tremble with something between rage and vindication. Inside were documents I'd signed without paying much attention during those first foggy months after Roberto's death, when Marcus had insisted on handling all the legal complications of settling the estate. Power of attorney forms that gave me access to Marcus's business accounts during emergencies, co-signer agreements for his mortgage and business loans that made me financially responsible for his debts but also gave me certain rights regarding his assets. Investment accounts that listed me as a beneficiary but also as an authorized user with full transaction privileges. Roberto had set up these arrangements as a safety net, a way to protect our son's business during its vulnerable early years. Marcus had probably forgotten about most of them, treating them as paperwork that needed to be filed rather than legal documents that granted me significant access to his financial life. I'd spent the rest of that sleepless night researching my options, calling in favors from Roberto's old business associates, and consulting with lawyers who specialized in financial planning rather than family law. By sunrise, I'd had a plan that was both perfectly legal and absolutely devastating. The beauty of financial warfare is its precision. Unlike emotional manipulation or public confrontation, money moves quietly through systems that most people don't understand and can't control once they're set in motion. Cassandra had chosen to attack my heart by threatening my relationship with Isabella. I was going to respond by attacking something she valued even more: her lifestyle and security. My first call had been to Patricia Restrepo, Roberto's former business partner, who now ran one of the most successful financial consulting firms in South Florida. Patricia and I had remained close after Roberto's death, bonding over our shared experience of building something meaningful with our husbands and then learning to navigate the world alone. "Myrtle," Patricia had said when I'd called her at 7 that morning, "you sound different. What's going on?" I'd explained the situation in broad strokes, focusing on the financial aspects rather than the emotional devastation. Patricia had listened without interruption, and when I'd finished, her response had been swift and professional. "Bring me everything," she'd said. "Bank statements, credit reports, loan documents, investment records. If Marcus has given you any kind of financial access, we need to understand exactly what your options are." That afternoon, I'd driven to Patricia's office in downtown Miami, with a briefcase full of documents and a determination that surprised even me. Her office overlooked Biscayne Bay, and as we'd spread my paperwork across her conference table, I'd watched boats moving through the water below and thought about navigation, about choosing your course carefully and adjusting for changing conditions. "This is interesting," Patricia had said after reviewing the power of attorney documents. "Marcus essentially gave you emergency access to everything. Business accounts, personal investments, even the mortgage on his condo." "What does that mean practically?" I'd asked. Patricia had smiled, and it hadn't been a pleasant expression. "It means that if you can demonstrate a legitimate financial emergency, you have the legal right to freeze his accounts, redirect his investments, and essentially lock him out of his own financial life until the emergency is resolved." "What constitutes a financial emergency?" "Suspicious activity that suggests fraud or identity theft," she'd explained. "Large unusual transactions, charges in foreign countries, patterns that don't match his normal spending habits. The kind of thing that would require immediate action to protect the account holder from further losses." I'd stared at her across the conference table, understanding dawning like sunrise over the ocean. "And who determines whether activity is suspicious?" "The person with power of attorney," Patricia had said. "Acting in the account holder's best interests, of course." That evening, I'd begun my research into Marcus and Cassandra's financial habits, using the access I'd been granted to review their spending patterns, travel history, and credit utilization. What I'd discovered had been even more useful than I'd hoped. They lived beyond their means, maintaining a lifestyle that required every dollar of Marcus's income, plus regular dips into credit to cover the gaps. The penthouse condo, the luxury cars, the designer clothes, the expensive dinners at South Beach restaurants, all of it was financed by a combination of business income and revolving debt that would collapse if any piece of the puzzle were disrupted. More importantly, they'd been using credit cards that listed me as an emergency contact and authorized user, probably at Roberto's suggestion years earlier, when Marcus's business had been struggling to establish credit. Those cards carried substantial balances that were paid off monthly, but represented a significant portion of their available credit. Cassandra's interior design business was barely breaking even, despite her social media presence and wealthy client base. Her expenses for photography, marketing, and maintaining her image as a successful designer consumed most of her revenue, leaving her dependent on Marcus's income for her personal expenses. They were what Patricia called income rich but cash poor, people who appeared wealthy but had no financial cushion to survive any disruption to their carefully balanced budget. They were exactly the kind of people who could be destroyed by a well-timed financial crisis. I'd spent the weekend before their cruise departure making careful preparations, moving money into accounts they couldn't access, documenting their spending patterns, and creating a paper trail that would justify the actions I was about to take. By Monday morning, I'd been ready to execute the first phase of my plan. The cruise ship had been scheduled to depart Miami at 4 in the afternoon, giving Marcus and Cassandra just enough time to check out of their last-minute spa appointments and arrive at the terminal for boarding. I'd timed my first move for exactly 15 minutes after the ship had left port, when they'd be too far from shore to return and too committed to the voyage to change their plans. My call to the credit card fraud department had been brief and professional. I'd identified myself as an authorized user reporting suspicious activity on several accounts. Large charges at luxury retailers that didn't match the cardholder's normal spending patterns. Restaurant bills in amounts that seemed inconsistent with their usual dining habits. Cash advances that suggested possible identity theft. I'm concerned that someone may have gained access to their account information, I'd explained to the fraud specialist. The charges started appearing just before they left for vacation, and I'm worried about what might happen while they're out of the country. The representative had been grateful for my vigilance and had immediately frozen all the affected accounts pending investigation. The process would require Marcus and Cassandra to contact the bank directly to verify their identity and authorize any charges they claimed were legitimate, but that would be difficult to do from a cruise ship with limited internet access. My second call had been to their mortgage company, reporting irregular activity on the automatic payment system that suggested possible fraud. As a co-signer with access to the payment account, I'd been authorized to freeze the automatic payments until the irregularities could be investigated. The third call had been the most satisfying. I'd contacted Marcus's business bank and reported suspicious wire transfers that appeared to be moving money into unauthorized accounts. As someone with emergency access to protect the business from fraud, I'd been able to freeze the accounts until Marcus could personally verify his identity and explain the questionable transactions. By 6 o'clock that evening, Marcus and Cassandra had been halfway to the Bahamas, with no access to their credit cards, no ability to make their mortgage payment, and no way to access the business accounts that funded their lifestyle. More importantly, they had no immediate way to fix any of it. I'd celebrated that first victory with a glass of Roberto's best champagne, sitting on my patio as the sun set over Coral Gables, and imagining the moment when they'd try to pay for their first romantic dinner on board and discover their cards had been declined. But that had been just the beginning. Over the next 10 days, while Marcus and Cassandra had been discovering the limitations of a vacation funded by frozen accounts, I'd been systematically dismantling the financial foundation of their comfortable life. I'd used my authorized access to redirect their investment dividends into a secure account, ostensibly to protect the funds from the suspected fraud. I'd reported additional suspicious activity that required extended investigation periods, each report adding days to the account freezes. I'd even managed to trigger an identity verification process with their insurance company that suspended their coverage pending additional documentation. The cruise line's customer service department had been extremely helpful when I'd called to express concerns about my son's ability to pay for onboard expenses. As someone listed as an emergency contact, I'd been authorized to place a hold on all charges to their cabin until the suspicious account activity could be resolved. We certainly don't want them to incur charges they'll be unable to pay, the representative had assured me. This kind of proactive monitoring really protects everyone involved. By the end of their first week at sea, Marcus and Cassandra had been reduced to using the small amount of cash they'd brought for tips and souvenirs. No spa treatments, no specialty dining, no shore excursions, no romantic photographs with professional photographers. Just the basic cruise package they'd already paid for, and whatever free activities were included in their cabin fare. I'd received my first angry phone call from Marcus on day 8 of their cruise. The ship's satellite connection had apparently been strong enough for him to finally get through to someone at the bank, only to discover the full scope of his financial paralysis. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" he'd shouted into the phone, his voice crackling with static and fury. "All our accounts are frozen, our credit cards are blocked, and the bank says you reported suspicious activity." I'd been sitting in my garden when he'd called, deadheading orchids and enjoying the peaceful morning routine I'd developed since reclaiming my life from Cassandra's manipulation. "Marcus," I'd said calmly, "I was protecting you from what appeared to be fraud. There were charges and transactions that didn't fit your normal patterns." "What charges?" he demanded. "What transactions? Everything we've spent has been legitimate. Well, there were the expensive restaurant bills that seemed unusually high, I'd explained. And the cash advances that appeared to be made without your knowledge. The mortgage company was also concerned about irregular payment patterns. Those weren't irregular payments, Marcus had said, his voice rising to a level that probably concerned the other passengers on the ship. You froze our accounts right before our automatic mortgage payment was supposed to go through. Did I? I'd asked with genuine surprise. How terrible. I was only trying to protect you from potential financial losses. There had been a long pause filled with static and what sounded like Cassandra's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out her words. Mom, Marcus had said finally, his tone shifting from anger to something that sounded like desperation. Can you please call the banks and explain that there's been a mistake? We're stuck on this ship with no access to money, and Cassandra is absolutely losing her mind. Cassandra was losing her mind. I'd allowed myself a small smile at that information, picturing the woman who threatened to limit my access to Isabella suddenly discovering what it felt like to have your life controlled by someone else's decisions. Of course, dear, I'd said sweetly. I'll call them right away and try to get this sorted out, though you know how these fraud investigations can be. Sometimes they take weeks to resolve, especially when the account holders are out of the country and can't appear in person to verify their identity. Weeks? Marcus had practically screamed. Mom, we can't survive weeks without access to our money. I'm sure everything will work out, I'd assured him. Try to enjoy the rest of your cruise. Isn't this supposed to be a romantic getaway? I hadn't called the banks. Instead, I'd spent that afternoon shopping for a boat. The yacht purchase had been Roberto's dream, postponed year after year as we'd focused on building the business and raising Marcus. He'd always talked about retirement cruises through the Caribbean, about anchoring in secluded bays and watching sunsets from our own private deck. Death had stolen that dream from us, but it hadn't stolen my ability to make it reality. The broker had shown me 3 different vessels, but I'd fallen in love with the first one. A 45-foot azimuth with sleeping quarters for 6, a full galley, and enough space on the main deck to host dinner parties under the stars. The previous owner had been meticulous about maintenance, and the boat was equipped with every modern convenience, including satellite internet that would allow me to monitor my financial warfare from anywhere in the Atlantic. She's beautiful, the broker had said as we'd toured the master cabin with its panoramic windows and built-in entertainment center. Perfect for someone who wants to experience the freedom of the open water. Freedom. That had been exactly what I'd been looking for. The purchase had been completed with cash, a transaction that had surprised even the broker who was accustomed to wealthy clients. But Roberto's careful financial planning had left me with more liquid assets than I'd ever imagined, and buying the yacht had felt like honoring his memory while claiming my own independence. I'd named her Venganza, Spanish for revenge, though I'd told the marina staff it meant victory. The distinction had seemed appropriate for a vessel that would serve as both my sanctuary and my command center for the ongoing destruction of my daughter-in-law's comfortable world. My second call from Marcus had come on day 12 of their cruise, just 2 days before they were scheduled to return to Miami. This time, his voice had been hoarse with what sounded like exhaustion and barely controlled panic. Mom, please, he'd said without preamble. Whatever's going on, whatever point you're trying to make, just stop. Cassandra hasn't eaten a real meal in 3 days because we can't afford anything beyond the basic dining room. She's having panic attacks about what we're going to find when we get home. Panic attacks. The woman who'd calmly threatened to limit my access to Isabella was having panic attacks because her credit cards weren't working. I'd found the irony almost poetic. Marcus, I'd said gently, I'm not trying to make any point. I'm trying to protect you from what appears to be a sophisticated fraud scheme targeting your accounts. There is no fraud scheme, he'd said desperately. You know there's no fraud scheme. This is you, isn't it? This is you punishing us for the cruise invitation. The cruise invitation. As if my devastation had been about not getting to attend their romantic vacation, rather than about the systematic exclusion from Isabella's life that the invitation had represented. I'm hurt that you would accuse me of such a thing, I'd said with genuine-sounding wounded dignity. I've been working tirelessly to resolve these banking issues. It's not my fault that financial institutions take fraud so seriously these days. What do you want? Marcus had asked bluntly. Just tell me what you want, and let's end this. What did I want? I'd wanted my granddaughter to know her heritage. I'd wanted to be included in family traditions. I'd wanted to be treated with respect, rather than managed like an inconvenient obligation. I'd wanted Cassandra to understand that love couldn't be regulated and controlled like a business transaction. But most of all, I'd wanted them to understand what it felt like to have your life disrupted by someone else's arbitrary decisions. I want you to have a wonderful rest of your cruise, I'd said sincerely. And I want you to know that I'll keep working on these banking problems until they're resolved. The third call had come the morning of their return, just hours before their ship was scheduled to dock in Miami. This time, Cassandra had been on the phone, her voice tight with the kind of control that comes from being barely able to contain hysteria. Myrtle, she'd said, skipping any pretense of pleasantries, we know this is you. We know you're behind all the account freezes and the credit card blocks and everything else that's been happening. Cassandra, I'd replied with gentle concern, you sound terrible. Are you feeling all right? Don't play games with me, she'd snapped. We've spent 2 weeks eating nothing but buffet food and drinking tap water because you've locked us out of our own money. Marcus's business accounts are frozen, our mortgage payment bounced, and our insurance has been suspended. How awful, I'd said with genuine sympathy. Financial fraud can be so disruptive. Have you been able to contact the authorities to file a report? You are the authorities, Cassandra had hissed. You're the one who reported the fraud in the first place. You're the one with access to our accounts. You're the one who's been systematically destroying our financial life while we've been stuck on this floating prison. Floating prison. Their luxury anniversary cruise had become a floating prison because they'd discovered what it felt like to have no control over their circumstances, no ability to make choices about their own comfort and entertainment. Cassandra, I'd said sadly, I understand you're upset, but I don't think it's fair to blame me for protecting your family from what appeared to be sophisticated fraud. Perhaps when you get home and can meet with the banks in person, this will all be sorted out quickly. We want to see Isabella, Cassandra had said suddenly, changing tactics. As soon as we get back, we want to pick up our daughter and bring her home. Of course you do, I'd agreed. I'm sure the Phillips family has enjoyed having her for these 2 weeks. It's always nice when grandparents get extended time with their grandchildren. What's that supposed to mean? Cassandra had demanded. Nothing at all, I'd said innocently. I just think it's wonderful that Isabella has had a chance to bond so closely with your parents. 2 weeks is a long time in a toddler's life. She's probably gotten very comfortable with their routines and expectations. The silence on the other end of the phone had been telling. Cassandra had created this situation by insisting that grandparents needed to respect boundaries and limit their influence on Isabella's development. Now she was discovering what it felt like to be separated from her daughter for an extended period while other family members shaped the child's daily experience. We'll be home tomorrow, she'd said finally. And we're going to fix all of this. I'm sure you will, I'd agreed. And Cassandra, when you do get everything sorted out, maybe we can have that honest conversation about boundaries and family roles. I think recent events have given us all some new perspective on what's really important. I'd hung up the phone and walked out to my garden, where Isabella was helping me plant new orchid seedlings in preparation for spring. She'd been staying with me for the past 3 days while the Phillips family dealt with their own family emergency, something about elderly relatives in Key West who needed immediate assistance. The emergency had been fictional, of course, created by a carefully placed phone call from Elena pretending to be a social worker concerned about the welfare of an elderly couple who'd fallen behind on their medications. The Phillips family had rushed south to help, leaving Isabella in my care until her parents returned from their cruise. Abuela, Isabella had said, holding up a tiny seedling with dirt-covered hands. Pretty flower. Si, mi amor, I'd replied, kneeling down to help her position the plant properly. Very pretty flowers. And look how strong this little plant is, even though it's so small. Isabella had nodded seriously, her dark eyes focused on the delicate orchid with the intensity that children bring to new discoveries. She'd been speaking more Spanish during our 3 days together, remembering words I'd taught her months earlier that had been discouraged in her regular routine. Abuela, she'd said suddenly. Why, Mama and Papa know here. They're on a big boat, I'd explained, brushing dirt from her cheek. But they'll be home soon. Abuela, come on big boat too? She'd asked. I'd smiled and pulled her into my lap, smelling the sunshine and baby shampoo scent that was uniquely Isabella. No, M.I. Amor. Abuela has her own boat now. That afternoon, I'd taken Isabella to see the Venganza for the first time. She'd been enchanted by the gleaming white hull and the spacious deck, clapping her hands when I'd shown her the small cabin that would be hers whenever we went sailing together. Abuela boat, she'd announced with delight, running her hands along the polished rail. Isabella boat too. See, I'd agreed, watching her explore with fearless curiosity. Isabella's boat too. The marina had been busy with weekend boaters preparing their vessels for afternoon cruises, and several of my new neighbors had stopped to admire the Venganza and meet Isabella. She'd charmed everyone with her bilingual chatter and confident personality, switching between English and Spanish with the fluid ease of a child who saw no contradiction between languages. She's beautiful, one woman had commented, watching Isabella point out seabirds to her husband, and so articulate for her age. She gets that from her great-grandmother, I'd said proudly. 3 generations of strong Torres women. That evening, I'd cooked Isabella's favorite dinner, picadillo with sweet plantains and black beans, teaching her the Spanish names for each ingredient, as we'd prepared the meal together. She'd stood on a step stool beside me, stirring the sofrito, and asking endless questions about why we added each spice. Cooking is love, I told her, using the same words my own grandmother had used when teaching me these recipes 60 years earlier. When you cook for people, you put your heart in the food. Isabella put heart in food too? She'd asked seriously. Sí, mi amor. Isabella puts lots of love in the food. We'd eaten dinner on the patio as the sun set over my garden, and I'd pointed out the different flowers that bloomed in evening light, teaching her their names in both languages. She'd repeated each word carefully, her pronunciation improving with each attempt. After dinner, I'd read to her from a Spanish children's book about a little girl who sailed the Caribbean with her grandmother, discovering islands and meeting dolphins, and learning that the ocean connected all the places where her family had lived. Isabella had followed along with the pictures, asking questions about boats and fish, and whether we could visit the islands in the story. Maybe we can, I'd said, thinking about the Venganza and the freedom it represented. Maybe we can see all kinds of places together. That night, as I'd tucked Isabella into the bed I'd prepared in Roberto's old office, she'd asked me when her parents were coming home. Soon, I'd promised. And when they do, things are going to be different. Different how? She'd asked with the directness that children use when they sense important changes coming. Different better, I'd said, smoothing her dark hair across the pillow. You'll see. The next morning, I'd received my final phone call from Marcus before their ship docked. This time, his voice had been completely defeated, drained of the anger and desperation that had characterized our previous conversations. Mom, he'd said quietly, what do you want me to do? Just tell me what you want, and I'll do it. I'd been sitting on the Venganza's deck with my morning coffee, watching pelicans dive for fish in the calm water of the marina. Isabella had been napping in the small cabin, exhausted from a morning of exploring every inch of the boat. I want you to remember who raised you, I'd said simply. I want you to remember what Roberto and I taught you about family loyalty and respect for your elders. And I want you to have a conversation with your wife about the difference between setting boundaries and showing cruelty. Marcus had been quiet for a long moment. When he'd spoken again, his voice had been subdued. The accounts, he'd said. Can you unfreeze the accounts? When I'm satisfied that the threat of fraud has passed, I'd replied. When I'm confident that your financial security is no longer at risk. And when will that be? I'd looked out at the open water beyond the marina, thinking about navigation and course corrections, and the importance of knowing exactly where you stood before charting your next destination. When we've had that conversation about boundaries, I'd said, all of us together, including Isabella. Isabella? She's part of this family too, I'd reminded him. And it's time she learned how Torres women handle people who try to diminish their worth. The ship would dock in 3 hours. Marcus and Cassandra would discover that their financial paralysis extended beyond frozen accounts to bounced checks, suspended insurance, and a mortgage company that was very concerned about their missed payment. They'd spend days trying to untangle the web of fraud reports and identity verification processes I'd initiated, all while living off whatever cash they could scrape together. But eventually, they'd realize that the only way to restore their comfortable life was to negotiate with me from a position of complete powerlessness. They'd have to acknowledge that I wasn't just Marcus's aging mother or Isabella's indulgent grandmother. I was a woman with the resources and determination to destroy their world if they continued to treat me as expendable. The conversation we were going to have wouldn't be about whether I deserved a role in Isabella's life. It would be about what kind of role I was willing to accept, and what consequences would follow if they tried to marginalize me again. I'd spent 68 years learning how to be strong, how to build something meaningful, and how to protect what mattered most. Cassandra had made the mistake of threatening the thing I loved more than my own life. Now she was going to learn why that had been such a terrible miscalculation. The confrontation happened on neutral ground, which in this case meant the deck of my yacht while it was moored at the marina. I'd chosen the location deliberately, wanting Marcus and Cassandra to understand from the moment they stepped aboard that this conversation would happen on my terms, in my space, according to my rules. They'd arrived at the marina looking like refugees from their own life. Marcus wore wrinkled khakis and a polo shirt that had seen better days, while Cassandra's usual designer perfection had been replaced by the desperate look of a woman who'd spent 2 weeks wearing the same 3 outfits and rationing her skincare routine. Her normally immaculate hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face bore the pale, hollow expression of someone who'd been surviving on stress and minimal sleep. Isabella had run to them the moment they'd stepped onto the dock, throwing herself into Marcus's arms with the kind of desperate joy that children reserve for parents who've been gone too long. But even during their reunion, I'd noticed Cassandra's eyes scanning the marina, taking in the expensive boats, the well-dressed yacht owners, and finally settling on the Venganza with something that looked like calculation mixed with dread. "Mom," Marcus had said after the initial flurry of Isabella's excitement had settled, "we need to talk." "Of course we do," I'd agreed, gesturing toward the yacht. "Let's go aboard. Isabella, would you like to show Mama and Papa your boat?" The possessive pronoun hadn't been accidental, and I'd seen Cassandra's jaw tighten at the implication that Isabella considered the Venganza to be partially hers. But she'd followed Marcus and Isabella aboard without comment, her designer heels clicking uncertainly on the teak deck, as she'd tried to maintain her balance on the gently rocking vessel. The main deck of the Venganza was designed for entertaining, with comfortable seating areas, a wet bar, and panoramic views of the water. I'd set out fresh fruit, Cuban coffee, and homemade pastelitos, creating the kind of welcoming atmosphere that made it clear I was the hostess, and they were my guests, dependent on my hospitality for their comfort. Isabella had immediately launched into an excited tour of her favorite features of the boat, dragging her parents from the bow to the stern, and chattering in a mixture of English and Spanish about all the things she'd learned during our sailing adventures over the past few days. "And Abuela showed me dolphins," she'd announced proudly, pointing toward the open water. "Big dolphins, Papa! They jump like this!" She'd demonstrated with an enthusiastic leap that had made Marcus smile, despite the tension crackling in the air. "That sounds wonderful, Princess," Marcus had said, lifting her up to sit on the rail while he held her securely. But his eyes had been on me, trying to read my intentions, trying to understand what kind of conversation we were about to have. Cassandra had remained silent during Isabella's presentation, but I'd watched her taking mental inventory of everything she saw. The custom upholstery, the state-of-the-art navigation equipment, the premium fixtures and finishes that marked the Venganza as a serious investment, rather than a recreational toy. Her expression had grown more strained with each expensive detail she'd noticed. "Why don't you sit down?" I'd suggested once Isabella had finished her tour. "You both look exhausted." They'd settled onto the plush cushions of the main seating area, while Isabella had busied herself with the box of nautical toys I'd bought specifically for our yacht adventures. The child was completely at ease on the boat, treating it like an extension of her grandmother's house, another space where she belonged without question. "This is quite a boat," Cassandra had said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "When did you buy it?" "Last week," I'd replied, pouring Cuban coffee into delicate porcelain cups. I realized it was time to start enjoying Roberto's legacy instead of just preserving it. The timing hadn't been lost on either of them. While they'd been struggling to pay for basic necessities on their cruise, I'd been making a cash purchase that probably exceeded their annual income. "Mom," Marcus had begun, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to navigate a minefield. "We need to discuss what's been happening with our accounts." "Of course," I'd said, settling into my own chair with my coffee. I imagine the fraud investigation has been quite disruptive. Cassandra had made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. "There was no fraud investigation, Myrtle. There was just you, systematically destroying our financial life while we were trapped on a ship with no way to fix it." I'd raised my eyebrows with well-practiced surprise. "I'm hurt that you would make such an accusation, especially after I spent so much time trying to protect you from what appeared to be sophisticated financial crimes." "Sophisticated financial crimes?" Cassandra had repeated, her voice rising slightly. "The only financial crime here is what you did to us, using your access to our accounts to freeze everything. Reporting false fraud claims, manipulating payment systems to make us look like deadbeats." "I reported suspicious activity," I'd corrected gently. "Activity that seemed inconsistent with your normal patterns, and potentially harmful to your financial security." "What was suspicious about it?" Marcus had demanded. "We've had the same spending patterns for years." I'd taken a sip of my coffee, savoring both the rich flavor and the moment. "Well, there were the unusually large restaurant charges right before you left for vacation, the cash advances that appeared on your account without your knowledge, the mortgage payment irregularities that suggested possible identity theft." "Those weren't irregularities," Marcus had said through gritted teeth. "You froze our accounts right before our automatic payment was supposed to process." "Did I?" I'd asked with innocent confusion. "How unfortunate. Though I suppose these things can happen when someone has reason to believe an account has been compromised." Cassandra had leaned forward in her chair, her composure finally cracking. "Stop playing games, Myrtle. We know exactly what you did and why you did it. The question is what you want from us to make it stop." The directness had been refreshing after weeks of diplomatic maneuvering. I'd set down my coffee cup and looked at both of them for a long moment, watching Isabella play contentedly with her toys just a few feet away, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around her. "What I want," I'd said slowly, "is very simple. I want to be treated like a member of this family instead of a problem to be managed." "You are a member of this family," Marcus had protested. "Am I?" I'd asked. "Because for the past year, I've been systematically excluded from every important family event and tradition. Isabella's birthday party that I wasn't allowed to help plan. Halloween activities that got canceled when I was supposed to be involved. Thanksgiving dinner that moved to your in-laws' house without discussion. Christmas gifts that mysteriously disappeared because they didn't fit your vision of who Isabella should become." Each item on my list had landed like a physical blow, and I'd seen recognition dawn in Marcus's eyes as he'd realized the pattern I was describing. "And then," I'd continued, "when I tried to address these concerns directly, I was told that my role in Isabella's life would be limited to whatever you deemed appropriate. That I could either accept your boundaries or find myself seeing much less of my granddaughter." Cassandra had opened her mouth to respond, but I'd held up my hand to stop her. "You made a fundamental miscalculation," I'd said, my voice remaining calm despite the years of hurt I was finally expressing. "You assumed that because I've been accommodating, I was powerless. You mistook my desire to maintain family harmony for an inability to defend myself when pushed too far." "So this is all revenge?" Cassandra had asked. "You destroyed our financial life because your feelings were hurt?" The dismissive phrase "hurt feelings" had been the final insult, reducing my legitimate concerns about family exclusion to the petty grievances of an oversensitive woman. "This is education," I'd corrected. "You needed to learn what it feels like to have your life controlled by someone else's arbitrary decisions. You needed to understand the consequences of treating family members as expendable." Isabella had looked up from her toys at that moment, sensing the tension in the adult voices even if she couldn't understand the content of our conversation. "Abuela Sad?" she'd asked with the intuitive concern that children have for the emotional states of people they love. No, mi amor, I'd assured her, my voice automatically softening. Abuela is just having an important conversation with Mama and Papa. Isabella had nodded seriously and returned to her toys, but I'd noticed that she'd moved closer to my chair, positioning herself within reach of my protective presence. This is about Isabella, Marcus had said suddenly, his voice filled with understanding and regret. This is about us limiting your time with her. This is about respect, I'd replied. Isabella is part of it, yes, but she's not the whole story. This is about being treated like a valued family member, instead of a burden to be tolerated. We never treated you like a burden, Cassandra had protested, but her voice had lacked conviction. Didn't you? I'd asked. When you moved Isabella's birthday party to a venue where I couldn't contribute anything meaningful? When you changed Halloween plans to exclude me from a tradition she was excited about? When you abandoned 40 years of family Thanksgiving dinners in favor of your parents' catered gathering? When you made my Christmas gift to Isabella disappear because it didn't fit your approved narrative of her identity? Each example had been delivered calmly, but I'd seen their impact in the way both Marcus and Cassandra had shifted uncomfortably in their seats. And when I tried to discuss these concerns, I'd continued, I was told that I needed to accept a more limited role in Isabella's life, or risk losing access to her entirely. You used my granddaughter as leverage to force my compliance with restrictions I had no voice in creating. We were trying to establish healthy boundaries, Cassandra had said weakly. Whose health were you protecting? I'd asked. Isabella's? Because she's never seemed anything but happy and secure when spending time with me. Yours? Because you were threatened by a 2-year-old's love for her grandmother? Or were you protecting some idealized vision of who you think Isabella should become? The question had hung in the air between us, and I'd seen Cassandra struggle to find an answer that didn't sound selfish or controlling. You want her to speak only English, I'd continued, even though bilingual children have cognitive advantages that will serve her throughout her life. You want her to distance herself from Cuban traditions, even though cultural identity provides children with a sense of belonging and continuity. You want her to prefer your family's values and lifestyle, even though diversity of experience makes children more adaptable and resilient. We want what's best for Isabella, Marcus had said, but his voice had carried uncertainty rather than conviction. Do you? I'd asked. Or do you want what's most comfortable for Cassandra? The accusation had been direct and unmistakable, and I'd watched Cassandra's face flush with anger and embarrassment. How dare you? She'd started, but I'd cut her off. How dare I what? Point out that your decisions about Isabella's upbringing seem designed to erase half of her heritage? Notice that every boundary you've established somehow limits her connection to my side of the family while strengthening her bonds with yours. Observe that your version of what's best for Isabella coincidentally aligns perfectly with what makes you most comfortable. Isabella had looked up again, disturbed by the rising tension in our voices. This time, she'd stood up and walked over to me, climbing into my lap with the confident expectation that I would provide comfort and security. Abuela, she'd said quietly, why everyone talking loud? Sometimes adults need to have difficult conversations, I'd explained, wrapping my arms around her small body. But it's going to be okay. Promise? She'd asked, tilting her head back to look at my face. I promise, I'd said, meaning it completely. The sight of Isabella seeking comfort from me, rather than her parents, had clearly affected Marcus. I'd watched his expression shift as he'd observed the easy intimacy between his daughter and his mother, the natural bond that Cassandra had been working so hard to limit and control. What do you want from us? He'd asked quietly. Specifically, what needs to happen for this to end? I'd been waiting for that question, and I'd spent the past week preparing my answer. I want to be included in Isabella's life as her grandmother, not as a supervised visitor with restricted access, I had said. I want to participate in planning her birthday parties, holiday celebrations, and other important events. I want to take her on overnight trips, including sailing adventures on this boat, without having to justify every activity to you in advance. Cassandra had started to object, but Marcus had silenced her with a look. I want Isabella to learn Spanish, I'd continued, not because I'm trying to undermine your authority, but because it's part of who she is. I want her to know her Cuban heritage, to understand the stories of her great-grandparents who built something from nothing, to feel pride in the strength and resilience that runs in her blood. And if we agree to these things? Marcus had asked. Then the fraud investigation will be resolved quickly, I'd said. Your accounts will be unfrozen, your credit will be restored, and your financial life will return to normal. And if we don't agree, Cassandra had asked, though she'd clearly already known the answer, then you'll discover how long financial fraud investigations can last when the reporting party remains concerned about ongoing suspicious activity, I'd replied. Banks and credit card companies take identity theft very seriously these days. They can freeze accounts for months while they conduct thorough investigations. The threat had been delivered with the same calm tone I'd used to discuss Isabella's bilingual education, but its implications had been unmistakable. Comply with my terms, or remain financially paralyzed indefinitely. This is blackmail, Cassandra had said, but her voice had lacked force. This is negotiation, I'd corrected. You established terms for my relationship with Isabella without consulting me. Now I'm establishing terms for your financial recovery that require my cooperation. It's remarkably similar, actually. Marcus had been quiet for a long moment, holding his head in his hands while he'd considered his options. When he'd finally looked up, his expression had been defeated but resigned. What about the yacht? He'd asked. Is this going to be a regular thing? Taking Isabella on sailing trips? Why wouldn't it be? I'd asked. She loves the water, she's naturally comfortable on boats, and she's already learned basic safety rules. I think Roberto would have loved seeing his granddaughter develop an appreciation for the ocean. She's only 2 years old, Cassandra had protested. She's too young for overnight trips. She's been staying overnight at my house since she was 6 months old, I'd reminded her. The boat is safer than most hotels, and I'm a more experienced caregiver than most babysitters. Unless you're suggesting I'm somehow unfit to care for my own granddaughter? The challenge had been clear, and Cassandra had recognized the trap. Questioning my competence as a caregiver would mean acknowledging that they'd been leaving Isabella with someone they considered unfit, which would reflect poorly on their judgment as parents. I want to see the boat first, Cassandra had said finally. I want to understand the safety features, the sleeping arrangements, the emergency procedures. Of course, I'd agreed graciously. Isabella can give you the tour. She knows where everything is. Quote, the inspection had taken almost an hour, with Cassandra examining every safety feature, testing every latch and lock, and asking detailed questions about navigation equipment and emergency protocols. I'd answered each question thoroughly, demonstrating the boat's sophisticated safety systems and explaining the extensive experience I'd gained through the sailing lessons I'd been taking since buying the Venganza. Isabella had been an enthusiastic assistant during the tour, showing her mother the life jackets that fit her perfectly, the special cabinet where the emergency supplies were stored, and the cozy cabin that had been set up specifically for her use during our sailing adventures. And Abuela teaches me about fishies, Isabella had announced proudly, and birds that fly over water, and how to make boat go fast and slow. You've been learning to drive the boat? Marcus had asked with alarm. She's been learning basic concepts about sailing, I'd corrected. How wind direction affects boat movement. Why we need to check weather before leaving the marina. How to identify different types of seabirds. Age-appropriate education about the marine environment. It's actually quite comprehensive, Cassandra had admitted reluctantly. You've obviously put a lot of thought into making this safe and educational for her. The grudging acknowledgement had felt like a small victory, recognition that my care for Isabella was motivated by love and competence, rather than the reckless indulgence Cassandra had assumed. So, Marcus had said as we'd returned to the main deck, if we agree to your terms, what exactly does that look like going forward? I'd pulled out a folder I'd prepared in advance, containing a detailed proposal for Isabella's schedule, educational activities, and special events. The document had been professional and thorough, covering everything from overnight sailing trips to Spanish language instruction to participation in Cuban cultural celebrations. This is very detailed, Marcus had observed, flipping through the pages. I've had time to think about it, I'd said dryly. And I wanted to make sure we were all clear about expectations going forward. Cassandra had been reading over Marcus's shoulder, and I'd seen her expression grow more strained with each page. Weekly overnight visits? She'd asked. That seems excessive. It's exactly what Isabella was used to before you implemented your boundaries, I'd reminded her. And it's consistent with the kind of grandmother relationship Roberto always wanted for his grandchildren. Spanish lessons 3 times a week? Marcus had asked. Children learn languages most effectively through regular exposure, I'd explained. And Isabella is at the optimal age for bilingual development. We're wasting precious time by not taking advantage of her natural language acquisition abilities. Cultural education activities, Cassandra had read aloud. What does that mean exactly? Cooking traditional foods, learning about Cuban history and traditions, celebrating holidays like Dia de los Muertos and Las Posadas, I'd listed. The same cultural education Marcus received when he was growing up. I turned out fine, Marcus had said quietly. You turned out proud of your heritage, I'd corrected. You turned out understanding that you came from people who were strong enough to rebuild their lives in a new country. You turned out knowing that your success was built on the foundation of your ancestors' sacrifices and dreams. Isabella had been listening to our conversation with the intense focus that children bring to adult discussions they sense are important, even when they don't understand all the words. Abuela, she'd said suddenly, we go sailing again tomorrow? That depends on Mama and Papa, I'd said, looking directly at Cassandra. They need to decide if they want to be part of our sailing adventures or if they prefer to stay on dry land. The invitation had been delivered with a smile, but its meaning had been clear. They could choose to be included in the expanded version of Isabella's life I was creating, or they could remain on the sidelines watching someone else provide their daughter with adventure and cultural enrichment. I think, Marcus had said slowly, that we need to find a way to make this work for everyone. Cassandra had looked like she wanted to argue, but the sight of Isabella's expectant face and the memory of their frozen bank accounts had apparently convinced her to choose pragmatism over pride. Fine, she'd said tightly, but I want regular updates about activities, locations, and schedules, and I want advance notice of any changes to plans. Of course, I'd agreed. Communication is essential for successful co-parenting. Co-parenting. The term had made Cassandra wince, but she hadn't corrected me. And the accounts? Marcus had asked. I'll make some calls this afternoon, I'd promised, though it may take a few days for everything to be fully restored. These fraud investigations can be complicated to unwind. The resolution had been anticlimactic after weeks of financial warfare, but I'd seen the relief in both their faces as they'd realized their ordeal was finally coming to an end. There's one more thing, I'd said as they'd prepared to leave. I'm planning a quinceañera celebration for Isabella when she turns 15. She's 2 years old, Cassandra had protested. Which gives us 13 years to plan properly, I'd replied. And 13 years for her to learn enough about her heritage to appreciate the significance of the celebration. The quinceañera announcement had been my final power move, a declaration that I was thinking long-term about Isabella's cultural education, and that Cassandra's temporary restrictions hadn't changed my fundamental role in my granddaughter's life. Abuela, Isabella had said as her parents had gathered their things. I stay on boat tonight? Not tonight, am I, amor? I'd said, lifting her up for a goodbye hug. But very soon. Promise? I promise, I'd said, looking directly at Cassandra as I'd made the commitment. They'd left the marina looking like different people than they'd been when they'd arrived. Marcus had seemed relieved but subdued, clearly understanding that the power dynamic in our family had shifted permanently. Cassandra had been quiet and thoughtful, probably calculating the long-term implications of the agreement she'd just accepted. But Isabella had been radiant with excitement about the sailing adventures she'd been promised, chattering about dolphins and seabirds and the special cabin that was just for her on Abuela's boat. That evening, I'd sat on the Venganza's deck with a glass of champagne, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink while I'd made the phone calls that would restore Marcus and Cassandra's financial access. The fraud reports had been withdrawn, the account freezes had been lifted, and the identity verification processes had been expedited. By morning, they'd be able to access their money again, pay their overdue bills, and resume their comfortable lifestyle. But they'd never again make the mistake of thinking they could control or marginalize me without consequences. The next afternoon, Isabella had returned to the marina with an overnight bag packed by her mother and a detailed list of instructions that covered everything from meal preferences to bedtime routines. Cassandra had personally inspected the safety equipment one more time and had insisted on reviewing our planned route before giving her permission for Isabella's first official overnight sailing adventure. "Emergency contacts," she'd said, handing me a laminated card with phone numbers. "Coast Guard frequency is programmed into your radio. Weather updates every 4 hours. And please text me photos so I know she's safe and happy." The level of detail had been excessive, but I'd recognized it as Cassandra's way of coping with the new reality of shared authority over Isabella's activities. "She'll be perfectly safe," I'd assured her. "And she'll have the time of her life." We'd sailed south toward the Keys that afternoon, with Isabella helping me adjust the sails and pointing out every dolphin fin and pelican she'd spotted. She'd been fearless and fascinated, asking endless questions about navigation and weather and the marine life we'd encountered along the way. That night, anchored in a protected cove near Elliott Key, we'd cooked dinner together in the galley, while I'd taught her a Spanish lullaby that my own grandmother had sung to me. She'd fallen asleep to the gentle rocking of the boat and the sound of small waves lapping against the hull, more peaceful and secure than I'd seen her in months. 3 weeks later, Marcus had called to tell me that Cassandra was pregnant again. "We wanted you to be one of the first to know," he'd said, his voice carrying genuine warmth for the first time since their return from the cruise. "And we were hoping you might want to help us plan the baby shower." Help plan the baby shower. Not be invited to attend someone else's event, but actively participate in creating the celebration. It had been a small gesture, but it had represented a fundamental shift in how they viewed my role in their family. "I would love to," I'd said sincerely. "Boy or girl?" "Too early to tell," Marcus had replied. "But either way, we want this baby to grow up knowing both sides of their heritage. We've been thinking about names that work in both English and Spanish. Names that worked in both languages. Cultural identity that was celebrated rather than suppressed. A grandchild who would grow up bilingual and bicultural from birth, never having to choose between different parts of themselves." 6 months later, I'd been present for the birth of my second grandchild, a boy they'd named Roberto Diego in honor of his grandfather and great-grandfather. Isabella had been thrilled to become a big sister, and she'd immediately begun teaching her baby brother the Spanish words for family members. "This is Abuelito Roberto," she'd whispered to the baby, showing him the photograph that sat on my mantel. "He lives in the stars now, but he watches over us when we're sailing." The integration of Roberto's memory into their family narrative had been Cassandra's idea, part of her apparent decision to embrace, rather than resist, the cultural heritage her children would inherit. She'd even started taking Spanish lessons herself, claiming she wanted to understand the lullabies I sang to Roberto Diego. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and there had been moments of tension and negotiation as we'd all adjusted to our new family dynamic. But the financial crisis had served its purpose, demonstrating that respect was a requirement rather than a luxury in family relationships. The Venganza had become our family's floating sanctuary, a place where Isabella and Roberto Diego could learn about their heritage while developing confidence and independence on the water. Isabella had become an accomplished young sailor, able to tie basic knots and identify weather patterns that might affect our plans. "Abuela," she'd said one afternoon as we'd sailed through the clear waters near Key Biscayne, "why did Mama and Papa go on the big boat without us?" I'd looked at my granddaughter, now 4 years old and wise beyond her years, and smiled at the memory of the cruise that had changed everything. "Sometimes people need to learn important lessons," I'd said. "And sometimes the best way to learn is to experience what it feels like when things don't go according to plan." Did they learn their lesson? "What do you think?" I'd asked, watching her consider the question with the seriousness she brought to all matters of family dynamics. "I think they learned that Abuela is very smart," she'd said finally, "and that families should be nice to each other." "Sí, mi amor," I'd agreed, adjusting our heading toward the marina, where Cassandra would be waiting with Roberto Diego and dinner plans that included my favorite Cuban restaurant. Families should definitely be nice to each other. The yacht rocked gently beneath us as we'd sailed toward home, carrying my granddaughter toward a future where she'd never have to choose between the different parts of herself. Where her Spanish would be celebrated rather than discouraged. Where her cultural heritage would be a source of strength rather than something to overcome. I'd kept my promise to Roberto in ways I'd never expected, ensuring that his memory and values would live on through the grandchildren he'd never had the chance to meet. But more importantly, I'd kept my promise to myself, proving that kindness was not the same as weakness, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept unacceptable treatment. The sun had set behind us as we'd returned to the marina, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that had inspired Cuban poets for generations. In the distance, I could see Cassandra waiting on the dock with Roberto Diego in her arms, waving as she'd spotted our approaching sail. We were all home now, in every sense that mattered. And if anyone ever doubted that again, well, the Venganza was always ready for another sailing adventure. After all, the Caribbean is a very big ocean, and there are countless places where a clever grandmother could take her grandchildren to teach them about navigation, weather patterns, and the importance of always knowing exactly where you stand. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.